who are just tuning in here, he has been found guilty now in this New York State case. There are 3 other cases pending. One is a state case in Georgia. 2 are federal cases. One regarding efforts to subvert the election in 2020 and January 6th. The other having to do with holding on to classified documents. But generally speaking, it is not expected that any of those cases will proceed to trial before Election Day.
And more than that, there's a strong probability that if any of the 2 federal cases are still pending when he's inaugurated, they will disappear. Either he will appoint an attorney general who is favorable to him, that attorney general will dismiss the cases, and barring that, he may attempt a self-pardon, which may or may not work. We simply don't know.
And if Biden wins, they continue, but he's a private citizen. And we'll see where that leads.
Exactly right.
Just a quick legal point. He is not a convicted felon until he's sentenced? Is that...
Technically, yes. Technically, once he is sentenced, he will be a felon. He is technically a felon now, but typically the end of the case, the trial court end of the case, is upon the sentence. Then you file your notice of appeal, and then you are considered a felon during the pendency of that appeal. There are some jurisdictions where, strangely, Massachusetts is one. While your case is on appeal, a very famous Aaron Hernandez, the wide receiver for the Patriots, died while his case was on appeal. And under Massachusetts law, that resulted in him not having a criminal history. That is the exception. That is not the norm.
As we talk about the other legal issues that the former president faces, it may be worth getting a gut check on the timing and the timeline here for those 3 cases, Savannah, that you've laid out. The next one that we're watching the most closely is that federal election interference case, because we are waiting for that critical decision from the Supreme Court at some point, probably by the end of next month, by the end of June, before their term ends, when they will decide on the former president's claim of immunity in that case. There's the Florida federal case on the classified documents that were taken to Mar-a-Lago after the former president's time in the White House. They're going through a whole bunch of pretrial issues on that one. The next hearing is late July. It really doesn't look like that one is close to beginning at this point, as it is sort of working through the system here. And then there's that state case in Georgia, the Fulton County election interference case. The next hearing in August is on the former president's appeal regarding the prosecutor in that case, Fani Willis, and whether she should be allowed to continue to prosecute the claims against him. So the timeline is stretching, right? I mean, this is the case that I think people thought, if it came, would be resolved prior to the election, and that's exactly what we're seeing here.
Let's bring in someone who worked for Mr. Trump's White House, former White House Deputy Press Secretary Hogan Gidley. Hogan, thank you for being with us. Give me your initial thoughts.
Well, someone I worked with for a long time, actually, on the first impeachment was a man named Alan Dershowitz, who you know very well. And he said one of the things that he was most concerned about in all of these matters with Donald Trump was the venue. Donald Trump alluded to it in his comments there. You hit on some of them where he pointed out the real verdict is going to be on November 5th. Couldn't get a fair trial here. The venue was a problem. He also said this is far from over. I think that's very poignant from the former president, because he understands just what is at stake here. And I know, Savannah, for example, you used to be a reporter there at Court TV. I think you're even an attorney, as I recall. And for the life of me, I can't imagine any other case where you would allow a defendant to stand trial for a month, but no one would tell you what you were accused of until the last part of the closing arguments. The whole thing on its face, in my opinion, is a complete and total joke. Now, what the left has gotten in this verdict is exactly what they wanted. Yes, they wanted to bleed him dry financially. Yes, they wanted to keep him off the campaign trail. And they wanted to be able to call him a convicted felon. This is purely political, and you're going to see that when Joe Biden himself is going to address this from the White House, elevating this and showing some of the rampant politics around these proceedings.
Well, Hogan, just a point of correction there. Of course, the former president knows very well what the charges are against him. They're laid out in a 34-count indictment. But I think what you're referring to, which is a fair point, is that some of those underlying crimes that are sort of the girding and the foundation of those charges, which are clearly delineated, those were not really delineated until the final hour in closing argument. So I understand what you're saying. I just want to make sure that we're clear about that.
And how do you mount a defense if you don't know those things? Those are key to the case.
Well, there were aspects of it that came out through the trial. So yes, and by the way, the defense did respond to them in the trial.
Just want to note, as we talk about what is happening politically here, and as Hogan has brought up, for example, President Biden, in just the last minute, he has tweeted from his campaign account that there's only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office: at the ballot box. Now, not specifically referencing the verdict, not specifically referencing the convictions here for the former president. But interesting, Savannah and Lester, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden are saying it all comes down to November. On that, these two agree on that point.
Well, there's no question. And I think there were partisans, people who are obviously not fans of the former president, who were hoping there would be a legal resolution to what they perceive as a political problem. That, in all likelihood, is not going to happen. Although we will see whether or not the Judge Marchand sees fit to give him jail time and how that might affect anything. But again, I mean, it's as extraordinary as it is. Our Constitution has very few requirements in terms of eligibility to be president. You got to be 35 years old. You have to have lived in this country for 10 years, and you have to be a natural-born citizen. And why? The founders didn't want to put a list of requirements. They wanted the voters to decide. They wanted the voters to say, this is unacceptable for us, for a president, and this is fine. And that is essentially what will happen in this election in November.
What we're seeing, too, from the Biden campaign is this pivot to a degree, or at least a shift towards what a senior campaign official had told me just within the last 72 hours that they had wanted to do. Once this trial ends, remind people that this is a very, in their view, a very stark and clear choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And you're seeing that in this statement that is just in now from the Biden-Harris campaign through a spokesperson. It is not from the president or the vice president, saying that today's verdict does not change the fact that the American people face a simple reality. There is still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box. It also says that Donald Trump has always, again, from the Biden campaign, mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law for his own personal gain. So obviously, the legal issues fold into what the Biden campaign will press as a character case against the former president. And the former president will use his legal issues, not just this one, but the other ones as well, to try to make the case that he is the one who is a victim.
Well, that's what's interesting about what Hogan Gidley said. Fair point. He feels the left and the President Biden are going to use this politically. Perhaps they will, but certainly Donald Trump has used it politically to his advantage, I might add.
He raised $360,000, as far as we can tell, from small donors on day one of this trial alone, Savannah, based on the fundraising appeals. And he's got another one out tonight from the campaign. I'm just going to pull it up briefly here, where he calls himself, or the campaign calls him, a political prisoner. It's him with a raised fist here. I mean, it's begun already.
Let's go to Kelly O'Donnell, NBC senior White House correspondent. Kelly, at the White House right now. We know the president in recent weeks has been a little more willing to take jabs and mock Mr. Trump. We saw the tweet, or the X, if you will. Do we expect the president to make remarks about healing, about the court system, about all the things surrounding this?
In time, that is likely, Lester, but it is just a strange moment of timing that today is the 9th anniversary of the death of Beau Biden, the president's son. He is away in Rehoboth with family, marking that day. And the guidance we have had is there are no immediate plans for the president to speak on this issue. There is an expectation that the White House, in the official role, separate from the campaign, would emphasize the importance of respecting the rule of law. And inevitably, the president will be asked about the verdicts and what this will mean for the election and what it means for the country and the historical perspective in the days ahead. But right now, he is with family at their home in Delaware and focused on the loss they suffered years ago. So the sort of strange twist of history, that was such a pivotal moment, the death of his son, in encouraging him to run for office in 2020. And then on the anniversary of Beau Biden's death, to have a verdict in the New York trials of Donald Trump is just one of those strange coincidences that brings so much of this into focus about the larger context. So we expect that the White House will ultimately support the rule of law, support the jury's verdict. At the moment, it is the campaign that is speaking in terms of how they are responding, and again, pointing to November and the choice that Americans need to make. They have a couple of paragraphs in a statement that Hallie alluded to, talking about how this is a choice for the American people.
Kelly, let us just jump in here for a second, because I want to get outside to the courthouse. Tom Winter is our NBC News producer who was inside the courtroom as that verdict was read, and he joins us now along with our correspondent, Laura Jarrett. Tom, there is nothing like the tension in a courtroom right before a verdict is read. Tell us what it was like in there, whether the jurors looked at the former president, and any other color you can provide from the courtroom.
Sure. Well, it was really a 180 in what occurred in there because the judge brought us in. First off, the prosecution just showed up. We did not hear the bell. It's a 1960s rotary style bell that we typically hear when the jury has something to tell the court. That's what we've been hearing over the past day or so. The prosecution comes in. All of a sudden, Donald Trump and his team come in, and the judge says, look, it's my intention here to let the jury go at 4:30. And all 4:30 comes and goes, and we're about 5 or 6 minutes past that. He comes in and he says, well, we received a note from the jury at 4:20 saying they have reached a verdict, and they want about 30 minutes or so more to be able to go through the paperwork and go count by count and item by item. At that point, the mood in the court completely changed. You could even hear the air conditioning system in there over just a couple of keyboard strokes from reporters that were in the courtroom. Obviously, the tension built. Prior to that, the former president and his defense attorney were talking as if the day was over. They were laughing with each other, covering their mouths so that the cameras that are viewed in the overflow courtroom weren't seen. And so the focus was just kind of the day is done. And immediately the gravity of the moment struck everybody in the courtroom, prosecution and defense. And you saw a real change at the defense table, understanding that this was really it. To your point, Savannah, I noticed the jurors, and I did not see all of them coming in because of just the way that the courtroom was set up, but I did not see any of them make any eye contact with Donald Trump prior to the verdict being read. I did not see them make any eye contact with the prosecution either. At that point, the judge asked the jury foreperson, have you reached a verdict without telling me? He said yes. He stood. They handed him a handheld mic, which allowed all of us to hear what he was going to say. And then one of the courtroom staff members went count by count. All those 34 counts, which as you well know by now, were all guilty. There was not a ton of reaction within the courtroom. We had been strongly admonished by the court security officers. They didn't want any sort of outbursts of any type. Once the jury was polled, which as you know is the moment where the judge or the court asks each individual juror if what the foreperson read was accurate, they said yes. And then at that point they were let out, and there did not appear to be any sort of significant eye contact there either. And there were some jurors that, of course, over the course of a trial, as you know, are more animated than others. Some take more notes than others. But even those that were a little bit more animated, I didn't detect any sort of kind of a telling of what the verdict would be prior to it being read. So obviously a kind of a quick turn of events, putting all of this in perspective. For years, going back to September 2019, when the Manhattan District Attorney's Office asked for Donald Trump's tax records, asked for his financial documents, the two Supreme Court battles that followed all throughout the pandemic up until the point when they got those documents, at that point there, Savannah, this case kind of moved forward slowly because there was a bit of a change here at the office. There was an election. There was a different district attorney, as you know, that came in and took office. And the plan of attack, if you will, for this investigation and case changed after that point. And eventually we got the charges that we got today, and approximately a year later, well, here we are now talking about a verdict. Where does this go from here has been so often the question involving investigations surrounding Donald Trump for the past 6-7 years or so. Today, this is kind of a big moment because we have no indication whatsoever that there is now going to be any sort of ongoing criminal jeopardy for the former president and presumptive Republican nominee going forward. None from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, no indication that they're doing any additional work, no indication that the federal prosecutors about 2 blocks from me and the FBI 2 blocks from me is doing anything involving any sort of investigation involving the former president as it pertains or has a nexus to New York. Obviously, there's the other cases that you well know about. So it's a big moment today, a bit of a period on a number of investigations going back to the Michael Cohen guilty plea in federal court that surrounded all the conduct in this case. And so now we'll just have to see where those other 2 cases go. But as far as things go from here in his hometown, where so much of these investigations originated from or involved, including the conviction and jailing of his chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg, and the conviction of his company, it's over.
All right,
so
Tom, on that note, let me ask you.
Obviously, those guilty pleas.
Let me ask you, we're obviously seeing the helicopter shots around the courthouse, presuming the former president has not exited yet, but we know he was required to be in court every day and certainly to be in the courthouse during the deliberations. Is he now free to return to Florida, or is he does he still have to remain in New York?
100%, Lester. They addressed that at the end of the guilty plea in the proceedings today, or the guilty verdict, I should say, in the proceedings today. The prosecution said that he remains R.O.R., which is he's released on his own recognizance. There's no bail, there's no restrictions, so he's certainly free to travel to Florida at the instance that he wants to, or anywhere else across the country, obviously, as he continues his campaign. So at this point, Lester, there's no restrictions on Trump. The question here going forward to report out and get some clarity on, it was not addressed in court, is whether or not the gag order remains in place. What happens to that? Can Trump start to speak about the jurors? Can he direct his comments and obviously his Truth Social posts more pointedly at the prosecution and the judge and the people surrounding this case? That's a big question, whether or not he kind of goes on the attack. And obviously it was statements that he made that got him in a finding of contempt here, not put in jail pending this trial or during the course of it. But that's something that is a bit of a question, and perhaps a significant one, knowing how much the former president likes to talk about his particular cases, in this case in particular, whether or not he can do that and to what extent he can do that, Lester, going forward.
Tom, what about the jurors now? They're free. They've been dismissed. They've been thanked for their service. I think it was indicated the judge might chit-chat with them behind closed doors to thank them. A lot of times attorneys try to speak to the jurors. They want to learn what worked, what didn't about their cases. But they are free to remain anonymous, or they can identify themselves and do interviews, right? They're not under any further restriction from the court.
Perfectly put, Savannah, and that's exactly what the judge told them. The judge told them, look, you're free at this point to speak if you want to, not if you don't want to. He did want to talk to them afterwards, more of a process thing. He says, look, I can't talk to you about the case. I can't talk to you about how you came to your verdict, but I do want to figure out, were there any sort of issues with the process, things that worked well, things that didn't work well from the point of voir dire, obviously up until the conclusion of testimony and then their ultimate verdict here today. So that's what the judge is going to focus on. The jurors, not to get too much into their security plan for obvious reasons, given the sensitivities of the case and the fact that they are anonymous. There are little details that came out in the course of their questioning that have been well reported at this point, kind of a cross-section of people that you might expect here in New York City. And so really it's up to them. They will be taken to another location. Their security is assured to that point. So it's not a situation as if they're going to come out of the courthouse, say, behind me any minute. That's not what's going to be occurring.
All right. Tom, we want to point out that we've learned that DA Bragg is going to be holding a news conference, making some remarks. We're told about 6:30 Eastern time. So where are we? About 45 minutes now. We will look for that. Also want to point out July 11th is the sentencing date the judge issued a while ago. That is just a few days before the start of the Republican National Convention. So, Hallie, we can only imagine what that's going to be like.
And I think back to the few days before the Republican Convention back in 2016. Donald Trump was just announcing his vice presidential pick, who was then, of course, Mike Pence. And I wonder, how are we going to see this collision between the politics of this? Will the Trump campaign try to do perhaps some counter-programming to that degree, right before the Republican convention? We don't know yet. There's still more reporting to be done. But I think the thing that I'll be most interested to see, at least between now and maybe the next month, 6 weeks till that sentencing, is what do people say now that he has been convicted? Does the polling shift? Because right now, yes, we are seeing that some degree of people, even 6% of Trump voters, say they'd be less likely to vote for him if he were convicted. That's not a big number. But remember, this election is not going to be about big numbers. It's going to be the tiniest margins.
That brings me to Hogan Gidley, who is a former aide to Donald Trump in the White House. And Hogan, I'm giving you truth serum on this one, because I know that the former president will know how to spin this and know how to talk about it, and we've already seen that. But if you are in your old job and you're on the campaign, how concerned are you really about this conviction going into a tightly contested presidential race?
Well, I would be concerned, Savannah. And by the way, you don't have to give me truth serum. I always bring the truth to you. You don't have to worry about that. But let me give you some truth right now. 67% of Americans already believe these attacks on Donald Trump are politically motivated. 59% of Americans believe Joe Biden is part of it. Okay? That tells me so many in this country aren't really concerned so much about this, although the weaponization of government is a very big issue that Republicans, Donald Trump, will run on. They care about the issues that affect them every single day. And poll numbers shift and change based on information the public gathers. And so, for example, in 2020, they thought that Joe Biden Biden would unite the country. They thought he'd be good for the economy, good for the border, good for the world. No wars would break out. The exact opposite has happened. So you've seen a shift in those poll numbers, which is why Joe Biden is losing to Donald Trump in all the battleground states on all the most important issues. The same thing applies here. We'll see maybe a shift in the days and weeks following this, but as it begins to play out and settle, getting closer and closer to November, Donald Trump's right. This is where we're going to decide the next election will be on Election Day, and it'll be about the issues the American people care about. And when they can't afford gas and groceries, and when they have drugs pouring into their communities, killing our American citizens from Mexican drug cartels, and you have human trafficking and children being sold into sex slavery, wars breaking out all over the world, crime spiking, and when they do get caught, no one goes to jail, they are rejecting the Joe Biden policies. Right. That's what this election is going to be about.
Okay, Hogan, I'm going to wrap you because you're getting into campaign speech territory there. So let's stay focused, stay on the topic here. Let's go to Kristen Gibbons-Fedden, who is also an attorney. You prosecuted the Bill Cosby case. We're now looking at a sentencing date about 6 weeks away. You've got Judge Marchand, who's aware of what Danny Cevallos so ably laid out about in the typical case, this probably wouldn't be a case where you get jail time. On the other hand, you have a defendant who has violated the gag order at least 10 times and who did not receive any kind of penalty for that. Do you think any of this is like in the swirl of what Judge Marchand might be considering?
He absolutely would consider it. Absolutely. But as Danny pointed out, the most significant considerations and factors that really go into sentencing is whether or not he's committed a crime in the past. And he really hasn't. Yes, he violated the gag order, but certainly if the judge was not willing to change the bail conditions, he's probably not willing to sentence him severely as a result of the gag order. And then the other factors that Danny kind of brought up as well. Look at the severity of the crime. There's a low-level felony, and so it's probably not going to significantly impact the sentence in that regard.
Let's go to Stephen Hayes, an NBC News contributor, CEO of The Dispatch. Stephen, we were just having a colloquy with Hogan Gidley about the political impact. You, of course, are a Republican. I think you're no fan of Donald Trump's. However, how do you think this plays in terms of the election?
Yeah, well, I agree with some of what Hogan said there. I mean, I think the unfortunate thing for the country is this was the weakest of the 4 cases against Donald Trump. It was brought by a political prosecutor who needed to take a circuitous route, sort of double, triple bank shot in order to convict Donald Trump. And I think it was a weak case. Unfortunately, now what you have is a political situation where Donald Trump, if you've been paying attention to what he's been saying in his speeches, in his appearances, in his Truth Social posts, he has been laying the groundwork for this for a long time. Of course, it wasn't the Biden Justice Department that's responsible for this, but Donald Trump has been actively conflating the cases brought by the Biden Justice Department, the case in Georgia, with this case, and suggesting it's everybody out to get him. The Democrats are out to get him. And unfortunately, I think he has a better case on those grounds in this particular case, in this particular conviction, than he does in others.
Stephen, thanks very much. We want to cut back to outside the courthouse. You can see the aerials of Lower Manhattan. We believe the former president is on the move now, presumably going to Trump Tower uptown. Laura Jarrett, I think you're able to see this as well.
Yeah, you can see his motorcade making its way through the city, winding its way through Lower Manhattan. It's interesting, Lester, outside of court, it is eerily quiet. This had been sort of a chaotic scene in the moments as I was reading the verdict. You could hear a lot of cheers, a lot of boos. It all came very quickly as the 34 counts were coming in, as long as it took to read that. But right now, it is remarkably peaceful. There's obviously swarming with law enforcement that have been gearing up for this moment. Not predicting that he would be found guilty, but prepared for whatever may come, whatever the security risk is. These are law enforcement professionals that have trained for high-profile cases before, but obviously this is different. The stakes are higher. It is politically tinged. It has been sort of a tinderbox in this First Amendment area outside of court, where just weeks ago a man set himself on fire mere steps away from the courthouse. So law enforcement has been ready for this moment, prepared for this moment, whatever the verdict might be, and we continue to watch now the former president of the United States, now convicted of those 34 felonies, working his way through the city now, a different status, not politically perhaps, as you guys have been discussing for the past half an hour, but certainly legally. He is different, in a different category today, now having been convicted of these crimes.
All right, let me turn back to Kristen, if I can, to talk about the impact of this. We've already heard from some of the supporters of the former president. They believe this was a political process. So clearly there is suspicion, a suspicious glare glancing toward the court. But what about, or toward the prosecution, but what about the court itself? Has it suffered?
I hope not. I think absolutely, listen, the narrative that a lot of the Trump supporters are going to have is going to be maintained. They're going to say this was politically motivated, it was a witch hunt on the side of the prosecution, but we've already heard some negative comments regarding George Mershon and specifically his daughter and her affiliations with the Democratic Party, whether true or not, and how it impacted the case. And so absolutely they're going to look at the court system, and of course they're going to look at the jurors as well. Trump has made some statements about the jurors early on, before the trial started. So I absolutely think so. But at the end of the day, you know, I think one of the things that's really important here is Trump's attorneys had the opportunity to select the jury. That was part of the judicial system. And that is exactly what played out here. Trump had certain constitutional rights that were abided by and respected. And that's exactly what we saw in this trial. And at the end of the day, I think all of this could objectively agree that Judge Mershon acted appropriately, fairly, and he conscientiously made sure that he applied the law as it was intended to be applied, as precedent had dictated it should be applied.
It's interesting because in that very brief statement we heard from the former president, he took on the issue of venue, saying that this trial should have never been conducted in New York City, in Manhattan, which is a bastion of you know, liberal politics, that most of the jurors would not be Trump supporters was his assumption, and he's still banging on that drum. And speaking of, I think he just posted to Truth Social, Hallie.
He did. It is really reflective of what he said that we showed live outside of court, that this was a disgrace, he said. He continues to reiterate that he believes this is a rigged trial by a conflicted judge, etc. He says we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over, in his words. Again, an allusion to November. On this, go ahead.
No,
I was on the venue point. I think it's an interesting one because this is an issue that first thing he said when he came out of court, and I'll tell you, there was a lot on the bingo card of what he could have reacted to, what he could have said when he came out of court, and that's what he chose. It is worth noting here that his defense team only challenged one juror out of the 12. That challenge was obviously denied by Judge Mershon here, but it was, as we saw, an intensive and exhaustive voir dire process, too, for jury selection as well. Of course, Manhattan, obviously New York, does lean Democratic. That is the case. That is true.
And if he had gotten a change of venue, it would have still been in the state of New York, because it's a state case. You don't move it to another state.
Danny, how long before typically would an appeal process take for a case like this?
It could take years. I mean, most appeals take it takes several months to even get a briefing schedule. They have to file their notice of appeal relatively quickly. They get an appeal as of right to the appellate division.
What do you say they have to file it right away on the specifics of what they're challenging, or just that they're going to challenge?
Just a general notice of appeal, and that starts the appellate process. Then it's going to be in the appellate division first department, because that is the intermediate appellate court here that serves this county and close by counties. It goes up to the appellate division, and that takes months, sometimes years. It really depends on the congestion in the court. Arguably, you know, in a case like this, maybe it gets a little closer look, maybe it moves along a little faster, but no, we're months, many months, if not years away from a decision.
But during that time, you would be either serving a sentence or some kind of a sentence.
Yes. General rule is this. If you are serving a very short sentence and you have a major issue on appeal that has a likelihood that you can show is going to result in some overturning of your conviction, then you can suspend your, not suspend it, you can ask the court to hold it while you appeal. Mm-hmm. That is not the norm. That's the exception to the rule. But in all, obviously, if it's a sentence of probation, that doesn't happen. If it's a very short sentence and you have those constitutional issues, you can get them to hold off on your sentence. But typically, if it's a lengthy sentence and it doesn't involve any novel issues, then you're going to serve that sentence. Otherwise, everybody would try to prolong their sentence while they were on appeal, and nobody would actually be in prison.
We're watching the Trump motorcade as it presumably heads uptown to Trump Tower moments after, if you're just tuning in, the former president was found guilty. A sweeping verdict from a jury here in Manhattan, 34 counts of falsification of business records, a felony because the jury found it was in pursuit of promoting an election by unlawful means. And those unlawful means, Danny, are likely the fertilest ground for this appeal because, as we have explained this morning, the jury had to find that there was this unlawful means, but they didn't have to agree on what exactly it was that the former president did wrong. So how do you mount an appeal on that when they were given an assortment of laws that they could have said that there were violations of, but we don't know which ones they relied on? It's not in the court record. It wasn't on the verdict form.
I expect to challenge that the statute is what's called unconstitutionally vague. Now, it's presumed that we all know the law. It's a legal fiction, but the key is the law must prescribe certain conduct. It must say, thou shalt not do something in a way that members of the public can understand, whether or not they've actually read them, because it's presumed that we've all read the law, which obviously we haven't. But it has to be able to tell us with some certainty what is prohibited and what is permitted. And the argument I believe we'll see on appeal is that this statute is unconstitutionally vague because it does not tell us specifically, what does not tell a defendant like Trump or any defendant what exactly was prohibited. And then also, it may create a burden of proof issue, the statute itself. Again, nothing to do with Justice Merchan, but the actual statute as written may create due process issues, burden of proof issues. All of those are fertile grounds for appeal. And then if you go back to the facts, I guess I would put as number 2, maybe elements of testimony of Stormy Daniels, which at the time Justice Merchan himself said raised some concerns. In fact, the real problem was the defense didn't appear to object when Justice Merchan, it seems, thought they should have.
We're looking at the motorcade right now, and you'll note they've hit some traffic. Unlike a presidential motorcade, which could be 20 or 30 vehicles, this is very short for a former president and dealing with traffic now. Appear to be in the FDR. Makes me wonder if they're going straight to LaGuardia.
Could well be. He may want to get out of town, and he's certainly able to do that as he remains out on bond on his own recognizance. On that appeal issue, Lindsey Graham, who's of course the senator, a Trump ally, and an attorney himself, says he believes this will be reversed on appeal. But just to be clear about that, even if it were, if you win your appeal, you just get another trial. That's if the prosecutors choose to refile charges.
Yes, if your conviction is vacated and the case is remanded back for trial, then yes, a new trial is the next step. But sometimes appellate courts